Good evening and welcome back to Sports Talk ATL. I am Chase Earl, joined by Alex Lord. We are getting into some free agency Falcons talks. We're going to discuss the wide receivers today after doing edge rushers and quarterbacks earlier in the week. We're going to do some opening day roster predictions. We're only 3 weeks away from Braves opening day, which almost sounds ridiculous, but we are very close. So we're going to do that. We'll probably do it again closer to the season, but it is off-season time. There is not a ton to talk about, which is when these crazy lists comes out. And there is a recently crazy list of the top. It's the hot discussion on Twitter, the top college football coaches right now. Now, we can start off with the top of the list because, listen, I was wearing a Georgia Bulldog sweatshirt yesterday, and there is no doubt about with Nick Saban retiring. I think there could have been an argument between Saban and Kirby last year. Now with Saban out of the picture, you have a clear-cut number one, Nick Saban, the number one coach in college football. The rest of this list is up for debate, but there's no debate about that.
Yeah, you meant Kirby Smart. No debate, number one. And I would even say, even with Nick Saban still in college football, Kirby Smart was number one. But you could kind of argue it was 1A, 1B. Now that Nick Saban is out, there is a large gap. We're LSU fans. Even Brian Kelly, bias aside, there is a large gap between Kirby Smart and whoever you think number two is. Whether you think it's Sarkisian, Ryan Day, including Jim Harbaugh. So the two of the top three head coaches in college football left in one offseason, and they don't just suddenly get better. Whether you think it's DeBoer, Brian Kelly, again, whoever you think, Norvell, there is a large gap between Kirby and whoever you think is number two.
Yeah, I think that's what makes this so much fun this time around because, last year you'd have a firm top three. You'd have Jim Harbaugh. You'd have Nick Saban. But right now, the only two coaches in college football that have won national championships, Kirby Smart and Dabo Swinney. And I think a lot more people are down on Dabo Swinney. I still think he's probably up there with the top five college football coaches. I really do. I really do. I mean, the guy's won 2 national championships.
Yes. Who's doing less with more than
you say that, but I think quarterback play has had a lot to do with it. And listen,
he's recruiting the highest rated quarterbacks.
Yes, and listen, losing offensive coordinators, losing defensive coordinators, he hasn't done a fantastic job of replacing them, but I still think he's very much capable of continuing to recruit really well at the highest level. And then if he gets those coaches in place, those assistants in place, Clemson is going to be a force to be reckoned with. I think too many people are counting him out. Now, I wouldn't put him at number 2. I mean, I think it's fair right there, but I mean, you got a slew of guys that could be number 2. Ryan Day is obviously up there. People say he's born on third base, but you can't argue with a 56-8 record since he's become the head coach at Ohio State. Was literally a field goal away, or maybe not a blown coverage away from beating Georgia and winning a national championship 2 years ago. Right. I still think Ryan Day, if you have him at number 2, I have no arguments there.
I would argue, but I don't think that, you're wrong. This is obviously an opinion-based thing. He's firmly in the top 5. I'd say a lot of people would consider Ryan Day a top 3 head coach. But again, I can't stress this enough. He is not even close to Kirby Smart. None of these guys are. And that'll be the last time I say that. But I can't stress that enough.
And then, listen, Ryan Day, you could have Brian Kelly number 2. Listen, I think a lot of people are going to be like, oh, well, he hasn't won a national championship. What did I just say a minute ago? Nobody's won a national championship outside of Kirby Smart, Nick Saban. Yeah. Nick Saban's retired, and Jim Harbaugh. So Dabo Swinney, unless you want to put him up there number 2, whoever we're talking about in this number 2 spot has not won a national championship, whether it's Day, whether it's Sarkisian, whether it's Norvell. I would have Brian Kelly strictly because of the resume. When you talk about the winningest coach in Notre Dame history, when you talk about how he's been able to turn around LSU that was in a dumpster fire when Ed Orgeron left, and he's done it very quickly, back-to-back 10-win seasons. He's at 18 10-win seasons. When you look at the resume and the length that he's done it for, and I think he's going to get that national championship. Coach O won a national championship there. We know Coach O ain't a great coach. Les Miles, we know he ain't a great coach. They both won national championships. You look what he's doing on the recruiting trail right now. I think Brian Kelly, he firmly belongs in the top 5, whether you want to put him 2, 3, 4, or even 5. He's in that conversation, no doubt.
I couldn't agree more. You had 2 donkeys, literally donkeys, lead LSU to national championships, as Chase mentioned. Ed O, Les Miles. Neither of those guys have a job right now for a reason, because they're literal donkeys. If you can recruit the state of Louisiana, which Brian Kelly has now done, I think he has 9 of the top 10 recruits from last year's class and this upcoming class, you're going to contend for national championships because it is a breeding ground for NFL talent. It's just the facts. If you go look at, every single Louisiana high school recruiting class for the past 20 years, you'll find NFL talent littered, and not just 7th round guys. I'm talking premier NFL talent. So if you do that, you're going to be contending for national championships, and academics take a back seat to football at Louisiana State University. We both went there. Everybody knows what that business is about. We went there for football, not for academic purposes. And Brian Kelly, like you mentioned, all-time winningest head coach in Notre Dame history, one of arguably the most illustrious programs in college football history. He has won more games at that program than anybody else in history. And you're telling me, according to this Blue Bloods bias, I think,
don't put his name out.
Because he's ninth. Yeah, I mean, that's just absolutely ridiculous.
I didn't mention his name for a reason, because we're going off this list, and I wanted to create my own list because this list is terrible, and I did not want to give him any kind of clout because he is quite literally an idiot.
Yeah, he's a joke.
Anyways, I want to give you 3 guys. They're younger head coaches. They've had a lot of success earlier in their careers. Which one do you think wins a national championship first out of these 3? Steve Sarkisian, Mike Norvell, or Dan Lanning?
This is a really good question because this is how I see the rankings go. I think it's Kirby, and then I think in some order of the rest of the top 6, you could have Ryan Day, Brian Kelly, and these 3 guys in any order, and I wouldn't argue because Lanning has shown the blueprint in Athens, which originated in Tuscaloosa, is working very well in Eugene. I think that he's recruiting at the highest levels, and though they lost to Washington twice, they got a guy in Dylan Gabriel who's not going to miss a beat, succeeding Bo Nix. I love Sark. It's between those 2 guys for me. I am not buying into this Norvell hype. I really am not. I think Florida State's best shot was last year when all of their transfer portals and things like that kind of lined up perfectly. They had a super senior at quarterback in Jordan Travis. I really do think that, like, the only thing Florida State and Norvell has going for them is the surest path. Now that Oregon is in the Big Ten and Texas is in the SEC, the ACC is by far and away, out of those 3, the easiest path. So you could argue who could win a national championship first? Maybe Norvell, because the path is easiest. But if we're just talking who I want to be my head coach out of those 3, which I guess I'm, straying from the question, it's Dan Lanning. I want Dan Lanning.
I would go with Dan Lanning too, and I think him and Steve Sarkisian are probably going to be the popular picks. I'm going to push back a little on the Norvell, not overrating. I mean, because the guy came into Florida State. You want to talk about dumpster fires. That place was a dumpster fire. Not only did he beat Brian Kelly once to start the year, beat him twice, out-coached him both times. Like, he put on a show against LSU, and LSU had very good teams, both tiers, like I just said. And I think he brought physicality back to that Florida State program that had been missing it for over a decade. And if Jordan Travis doesn't get injured, I'll straight up say it. They are competing for a national championship. That team could have beaten Michigan. They could have beaten Alabama. They could have beaten any of those teams.
That's not a hot take.
Okay, well then I don't understand what we're talking about here.
I just think he
turned a program around in 3 years.
Think of it like the Michigan thing, where like Michigan's timing just lined up so well, where they had the right quarterback with all of these very experienced players, where that is the same thing with Florida State. Florida State is sending so many guys to the draft. Don't be surprised if Florida State loses 3 games next year.
Yeah, I mean but listen, like, all these guys pretty much that we've had on this list have lost 3 games in the last
I'd be surprised if Oregon and Texas next year lose 3 games. I would be surprised.
Yeah, well, they're returning a lot more talent than Florida State.
Well, they're in a much more difficult conferences.
Yeah, I mean, I would be surprised if Florida State lost 3 games. Listen, I'm just saying, you can't take anything away from 13-0. I don't care what conference you're playing. I don't care if you're playing JV football in high school. You go 13-0.
Well, listen, I don't want to act like I'm not crapping on Norvell. He's, like I said, if you had any of those guys that I mentioned outside of Kirby Smart, 2 through 6, I would have no arguments with you. Obvious, I have my opinions, but I'm talking Lanning, Norvell, Sarkisian, Kelly, and Day.
Yeah.
2 through 6, wouldn't argue.
Well, and then there's a couple
and
guys.
DeBoer, I mean, maybe.
Here's a couple of 3 intriguing ones after that. Kalen DeBoer, I mean, you just mentioned him coming off a national championship. Yep. Obviously, not a ton of people knew about him until he went to Washington and turned that program around. Lane Kiffin, that's another one. That's a fun one in Ole Miss. He's now made them a double-digit win threat every year, and they've never been that in the history of Ole Miss. And Lincoln Riley. Now, I know Lincoln Riley has gotten a lot of flack for how USC played, and he can't play a defense, but let's not act like this guy isn't one of the brightest offensive minds. I mean, this guy prints out Heisman as his job. So, I mean, listen, there's a lot of exciting guys that bring a lot of different things to the table, and most of them are younger that haven't had a lot of experience. So, as we talked about yesterday, all these coaches willing to leave. I mean, you got a group of head coaches there hungry to prove that they could be the next Kirby Smart. They can challenge Kirby Smart. And I think it's interesting, that battle for that second best guy who wants to be the clear-cut second guy is definitely a storyline to watch over the next several years.
Yeah, I agree. And, I'm going to kind of look like an idiot here and kind of contradict myself. DeBoer beat Lanning and Sarkisian twice. So if you want to talk about like head-to-head, like Norvell beating Kelly, should have him ahead of Kelly, you could say the same thing about DeBoer with far less talent at Washington compared to Oregon and Texas. And Lane Kiffin, again, it's kind of crazy. He just gets lost in the mix. And Lincoln Riley, like a college, going through this list is kind of, college football is in great hands. It's in great hands.
And a couple guys under the radar. They're not probably going to be national championship contenders because of the programs that they coach. But Kyle Whittingham up in Utah, one of the best coaches in college football. He's been a standard in the Pac-12.
That Kyle
Whittingham, Leipold for Kansas.
You're right. Fun one. Yeah, absolutely. Kyle Whittingham is the perfect example of the argument against, he hasn't won anything. Well, he's never going to win at Utah because of the resources provided at Utah. He'll never win there.
It will take everything would have to go.
Perfect. It would be the luckiest. And that's the argument for Brian Kelly. It's like, you don't have to be an elite head coach in college football to win, or you don't have to have won a college football national championship to be considered an elite head coach. Whittingham is an elite head coach.
Yeah, I mean, you put Whittingham at LSU, we're probably talking about the exact same thing that we're taking about Brian Kelly. Two more guys I want to just mention because they're kind of like could boost themselves into this conversation that we're talking about next year. Hugh Freeze for Auburn. I'm high on him. I think he's going to turn Auburn around. Yeah. And Luke Fickell for Wisconsin. Obviously, Fickell had a ton of success at Cincinnati, thought about going to Ohio State, stuff like that. Ends up going to Wisconsin. Interested to see if he can get the Badgers back on track because that is a program where you can win it, and they've shown it.
Yeah, I think Hugh Freeze is going to bring Auburn back, and I do think I like Josh Heupel right outside the top 10 on my ranking.
Yeah. So it's going to be interesting. I mean, a lot of really good coaches competing for that number 2 spot. Coming up after the break, we're going to get into some Braves opening day roster predictions, the first version of this so far.